Good morning, everybody. We're live from Radio France and live from different sites across the world to talk about quality and ethics of new jobs. To talk about this, we will have the successive presentations of Stéphane CARCILLO from the Cercle des Économistes, who is with me. Good morning. We will then have live from Australia, but she's from Rutgers University, Jennifer Hunt. Can you hear me? Good morning. She can hear me. I will give the floor to Helno EYRIEY from UNEF, the Students' Union. Good morning. Then Jean-Jacques GUIONY from LVMH will talk to us about these new types of jobs. Gilles BABINET from the National Digital Council. All of these people are live with us. And Karl-Petter THORWALDSSON from the International Trade Union Confederation, who will be with us. And in addition, he will be translated, of course, because he will be talking to us in English. So he's nodding his agreement. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us a brief 5-minute talk maximum to cover this question from your own particular approaches. So depending whether you're from a company or an economist or an academic or an observer or a unionist. But to have an overview of the challenges around these new jobs, I'm going to immediately pass the floor to Stéphane CARCILLO. Thank you, Jean-Paul. I'm just going to give you a few figures to begin with to set a framework for the debate and to raise a few questions that we will attempt to answer this morning. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about new jobs? We're talking about these new atypical, non-standard forms of employment. And of course, this makes us think of independents working on platforms that we're all familiar with. But more broadly speaking, they are forms of employment, for example, with ultra-flexible or short fixed-term contracts that we see developing throughout OECD countries, part-time short working hours, which people are obliged to accept, and also temping jobs. So the current context is very important because it has really revealed how fragile these new forms of employment are. And they are overrepresented in the sectors that have been the hardest hit during the crisis. For example, tourism, the hotel industry, the catering industry, or distribution services. And they can represent up to 40% of the jobs in certain countries. And of course, within the context of the crisis, these jobs have been extremely fragile because they can just be terminated very quickly. And this is what has happened. And when these temporary contracts or short-term contracts are terminated, this has given rise to more than half of the new numbers of the unemployed in the past months. So we can see that this flexibility is costly when the financial context changes. So why have these new forms of employment developed? So that's what we're going to try and look at today. So permanent contracts, long-term contracts remain the standard. In France, they represent 70% of total employment. We should recall this. But temporary employment has increased extensively in OECD countries over the past 30 years. For example, 30 years ago in France, we had 6% of short-term contracts in France, and now we have 7% 17%, and it represents 12% in OECD countries, generally speaking. So also the duration of these short-term contracts has become shorter and shorter over the past decade. A short fixed-term contract that lasts 3.5 months in France against more 20 years ago. So 1/3 of the contracts last only 1 day now. So, of course, we have daily contracts and we're just working on a specific task. So many OECD countries have part-time contracts with contracts that are below 20 hours a week. This is developed extensively. It's very positive because it has allowed a lot of women to get back into the job market. But a lot of these working conditions are not accepted happily. Very often people would prefer to work more hours. And generally speaking, in the OECD countries, independent employment is declining, above all under the influence of agriculture, where there are a lot of independents, and agriculture is becoming more and more modern, therefore there are fewer jobs. And we see a lot of new types of employment with entrepreneurs developing in France, which represent 2% of employment in France today, with a rising trend. Of course, this remains marginal. It's a very small number, but we can see the trend there with a lot of platform jobs that are developing. So the challenges of these jobs, so the stakes, are important because they make a lot of services possible. They're important for the adoption of new technologies in certain companies. And they're also important because these jobs are probably the jobs that will help us to really pull out of the crisis. So a lot of companies, because the context is rather uncertain, they started offering contracts for this type of jobs, and then these might turn into permanent contracts afterwards. But how can we better protect these workers? Because there is a problem of social protection. Very often, there are very few retirement rights or social security rights or unemployment rights. What are the rights for training? How can we make sure that these jobs are not just traps, but can act as a springboard to move ahead in the job market? How can we better organize a social dialogue so that these people can organize themselves when they're faced with big employers or individually? They don't have a lot of power to discuss pay. And how can we clarify the rules between employees and the new forms of employment to avoid abuse, to avoid misuse? And so we need to be able to protect people so they can work in the conditions that are identical to those of on long-term contracts, even though they're independent. So thank you. Thank you for having for having stuck to your 5 minutes. I'm going to give the floor to Jennifer Hunt from Rutgers University to answer this strictly economic question. Which are the economic forces that have led to the development of these new atypical forms of employment? Thank you very much, and thank you to the kind organizers for having invited me to talk. So good morning, everybody, and I say hi to everybody from Australia. So why have these atypical forms of employment appeared? I would like to draw a link here between technical progress and the growth of inequality in terms of salaries, and then the growth of inequalities and the appearance of these atypical forms of employment. So let's begin with the growing inequalities. It would appear that there is a common force in rich countries for the past 20 years, which is slowing down or is purely an obstacle to the growth of the least qualified salaries, whilst speeding up the rise of more qualified salaries. So salaries are increasing in many rich countries, but in France, this is underlying. It is masked by the policy of social charges and minimum wages. So it's not as easy to see in France. But it would appear that there is this common force in all rich countries. Sweden is also a rather particular case. So what is this common force? So actually, it is a question of technical progress. On the one hand, computers and automation benefit the best qualified and damage employment for the least qualified, and also the improvement of communication technologies. And I understand here that the creation of the web makes it possible to outsource and relocate work abroad. So there is a direct effect of technical progress here that is quite obvious. But I would like to underline the relationship between the increasing inequalities caused by technical progress and the appearance of these atypical forms of employment. So to create that link, we should note that in the past, many employers gave the least qualified employees a bonus in addition to their pay. So why? This depends on the country, but in a number of countries, one of the main reasons was the presence of unions. But in other countries, I'm thinking in particular of the United States, where the unions have always been far weaker than in Sweden, for example. There is a second explanation, which is based on the theory of deficient salaries, in particular the barrier of fair pay. And the idea is that employers are afraid that if the gaps in salaries are too great within their company, this will lead to the discontent among those who are paid the least, and that this discontent will reduce productivity. And therefore, employers have decided in the past to give the least qualified workers a bonus. Whereas with growing inequalities that is desired by the market, or sought after by the market, if I might say, a policy of fair pay has become increasingly costly for employers, and therefore employers have found the solution of getting rid of these employees from the companies, but whilst maintaining their services. So by using non-unionized subcontractors, and therefore the workers have more trouble comparing their salaries with the workers in the companies. And then this has given rise to different types of contracts, short fixed-term contracts, online platforms, flexible working hours, etc. And there's another advantage for the employers, and that is that it's easier to adjust labor depending on the context or if there is a shock. And so regarding the atypical forms of employment, these have come from the growing inequalities in pay, which in turn stems from technical progress and globalization.
That's very interesting, very clear, and I would summarize it as masking these inequalities rather than having them in front of us. So it allows us to keep social peace within the companies. So I'm going to give the floor now to a unionist who represents the students, Helno, EYRIEY, to ask him the following question: how can we help the young ones who start their career with all these new jobs? Hello everyone. Thank you. I want to thank the organizers for the invite. This is a broad question. How can we help the young ones? And you have 5 minutes to answer that question. After I cut you off. No worries. Of course, there's the relationship with training that is very important. These new forms of employment that are vulnerable, because everything was said as an introduction can be summarized by precarious forms of work, which are not looking into the long-term future of the person and just to cope financially rather than think about your career plan. I'm going to talk about what I know the best, which is education, university education. We adjusted to the new forms of employment in society. And I think, like any new form of employment that is fairly new, training in general. We have higher education, but vocational training as well. Internships must give tools to young people to go into work, into the workforce. And the question is, how can we help the young ones is mostly how to give them social protection. Because very often these new platforms, new forms of employment, new contracts are going with a lack of social protection. So the beginning of a career, and that's very often the framework in which the young people use these new forms of employment when they start their career, or if they want to work on the side of their education, for example, which is not really good, because any employment that would compete with your training or education is usually bound to fail, particularly in all the universities. And when you start your career because you didn't have a chance to have higher education, how do you combine training and what you want to do with your life and with your career? And I think there is the need to know how you can protect these new forms of employment and make sure that they can lead to cohesion, consistency with your own career choices, or that they can serve later on as to compensate the unemployment rate of young people that tends to grow, has tended to grow for a number of years now. How does it allow also to integrate the young ones in the workforce? And also, how can we say what we said before, to be flexible, and how can we get into a job market that is pretty blocked and still have access to these forms of employment that gives you a source of income? These precarious contracts are easier to get to because they're more flexible, but how can you have a relationship with employment, with an open-ended contract or a permanent job? If something is real today, is the young people today will not have the same relationship with employment than the previous generations. And they'll probably tend to be more mobile, more flexible, change career more easily. So in my view, the question that we should really ask ourselves is, how do we relate to these new forms of employment? Thank you very much. You will have the floor again in the second part of the debate and during the Q&A session. I now want to give the floor to the financial director of LVMH, who's also CEO of La Samaritaine, Jean-Jacques Gilles, and I'm asking him the following question: how do these new actors who are using these new employment, such as platforms, what are they doing? Oh, I don't hear you. Sorry. Okay, I was on mute. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Guiony. I would like to talk about it looking at platforms, because they are the ones who really change things around. And a lot of new forms of employment are coming from those platforms. And a large part of the debate comes from the question of integration of the service providers, because that's what the platforms are, within the platform, and how can we give them a protection. So we should start by looking at the relationship between the platform and the service provider to see if there's ways to improve this relationship. If we look at the relationship from the point of view of the platform, it's quite interesting, the supplier is somebody who's external to the platform, and that does not need to be integrated. Uber does not want to salary his drivers, as Booking.com does not want to employ the hotels that are on the platform. It's the same idea. The idea of having somebody on the payroll is absurd. Second point is that the platforms have to deal with activities that were growing up until to now and decreasing as of now, and flexibility and suppleness of the offer is the key element of their business model. And the rigidity going with the employment contracts is not manageable for them. The third element that is maybe more philosophical and goes back to the DNA of those platforms, they go around rules, they go around maybe laws or regulations. And why would they not go around the rigidity linked to employment contracts? And we understand that they don't want to deal with that. So from the point of view of the platform, integrating the service, the supplier, is not something that is needed or that they can even comprehend. So from the point of view of the person who provides the service, of course, we should not make everything general. For some of them, the income that they take that they gain from the platform is good, and they enjoy the flexibility that goes with it. In some cases, we can talk about a real alienation. The example of Uber. When the Uber raised the prices of the cost that they were getting from the percentage that they were getting from their drives, they were not happy about this. It's a complex subject. The three ideas. The first one is legal. In most European laws, there's a notion of economic independence, which means that a subcontractor cannot be cut off by the person who gives them the job if he does less than a number of percentage of his revenue. Why should not we transpose this relationship between the service supplier and the platform? The second point is financial. We can very well imagine in some jobs a fund where the platforms would put some money away that could be redistributed in difficult times, such as the one that we are encountering now. I don't want to reinvent social protection in a fatherly way, but we can imagine that the platforms would have an action of insurance that they don't have as well today. And the third point is political, would be to say that the regulation, particularly on the job market, came from the excess of capitalism, but that today what we're seeing happen with the platforms is a reaction to the excess of the regulation. The regulation managed and regulated the law of the jungle, and now we're trying to fight the excess of regulation. So it's a difficult balance to be had, and we'd like to kind of stop in the middle between the law of the jungle on one side and the excess of regulation on the other side. We should probably aim to have something more balanced.
Thank you. You're talking about regulation, so indeed we will now be looking at that question. And in particular, the question of access to data, which is essential for these platforms. And the role of access to data is the question that I'm raising to Gilles BABINET, who is at the National Digital Council. Hello, and thank you for having me invited to this roundtable, which is already extremely interesting. So, of course, I'm going to try and stick to my 5 minutes. I think that what has already been said is quite consensual. It's rather interesting, actually. if we were talking in the old world of on one side the employers and on the other side the trade unionists, there seems to be some consensus there. 3 points seem important for me to clarify. The first is that we're faced with a bit of a UFO here. We're used to fight against labor markets stemming from globalization, and we saw the turn that this was taking. And now we have a new characteristic. And for some of the jobs are globalized, but above all, they are now platform-based. So that means that the relationship to employment, as Jean-Jacques Guiony said clearly, is there's sort of a systemic asymmetry, which is rather problematic. And this asymmetry is reinforced because the regulators, the governments, don't necessarily have access to data. And therefore, it's something which is rather difficult to understand for the regulator, that access to data is a way in compensating for the asymmetry, because we can understand what the jobs we're looking at are like. If the jobs, for example, if we look at certain delivery people who just have a contract per delivery. So between two deliveries, there's no longer a contract with the platform. So we can understand the type of membership, the relationship between the platform and employment, etc. In some cases, we have had access to this data. I'm thinking of Uber in New York, for example. The city demanded that they should have total access to all of the data of the deliveries. First of all, for questions of security, but also for questions of regulation and social regulation of the work. So that's a really essential point, but which also means that the regulator must understand the data and be able to analyze it, and not only by legal specialized, but the data has to be understood by the regulator. The second point is from a contractual point of view and the social relationship. In France, 50 or so years ago, we installed the minimum wage, and it was sort of a safety net. To say to workers, you have rights, you have minimum pay, and the implicit objective was to induce a notion of social mobility. And so we say from that point on, you have a minimum wage which will allow you to progress in society. That's something that breaks the platforms. And so it appears to me that there are a few directions that we need to consider here. First of all, limitation in time. So we say we can capture certain type of employment, of jobs, very labor-intensive jobs, such as, for example, and typically people, Uber workers. And we could say, well, those contracts are limited to 3 years. And the renewal of licenses for Uber-type operators would be directly related to the capacity to create social mobility. That seems very relevant. And so to a certain extent, there would be membership, should be charges that are linked to rights to training, and that would create a sort of low-wage safety net, and so that people who are badly paid are not obliged to remain in that condition. That's something that we see elsewhere in the OECD, in other countries, and it's something else that will help us to avoid this wage trap. And another thing that happens in France, and this it goes along the lines of what EYRIEY said, we should avoid that part-time work. So part-time workers often are not unionized. And so if you work for a platform, you don't know the other people working for other platforms, and we do everything we can to prevent you from knowing them, because we try to stop them from joining a trade union. So what we could do is to impose upon all platforms, we must recall the elementary rights of these workers, and they must allow their workers to join trade unions. And so through the regulators, they should be able to get in touch with other workers to know what the working conditions are for other workers and to know what their social rights are. These are decisions that we could impose for certain categories of platform workers. So to summarize, access to data, minimum transition and a maximum duration of these contracts for a platform, and a reminder of social rights through different applications. Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor now to Karl-Petter Thorwaldsson, who is president of the International Trade Union Confederation in Sweden, and who will be talking in English and who will be looking at this underlying question, in particular with regard to what we, since the health crisis caused by the COVID, how can we avoid increasing inequalities among these more fragile workers?
Okay, thank you very much for having me this not so lovely morning, typical Swedish morning with rain and about 12 degrees. Of course, COVID-19 will be a big threat to the work markets all over the world. And my 5 minutes I will spend on how to prevent more people to go out into vulnerable employment and unemployment. And that, as you all know, will be the biggest threat the coming months and years for all the world to have the economy going as good as it can during COVID, and also to try to avoid mass unemployment again. So the first I would say is to do opposite of what we did after the financial crisis in 2008. If we start to do the same cuts in the state budgets and also with austerity all over the world, this will definitely become a much worse crisis than what we originally think about COVID. So I would say to all politicians and all experts, do opposite of 2008 and keep spending and don't try to save you out of this crisis. Secondly, I would say most of countries in the world have created system to avoid people from going from employment to unemployment by helping and assisting companies with salary cost. And so far this has been quite successful. If we look all the world around, the unemployment anyway outside the United States has not gone up as fast as we thought in February and March when we first was hit by COVID-19. So I would say continue to support the company's salary cost and take it away bit by bit so they can avoid to kick people out of job. And that is always the best medicine, to try to keep to have your job as long as it's possible. Of course, there will be job losses, but make it as few as possible by helping companies to avoid mass unemployment. Thirdly, and this is more economic questions, we have now seen figures of the cost of capital in the future, and all experts are saying that capital will continue to be really cheap. Most economists are saying the trend is rather to 1% interest rate than 2% a couple of years ago. So if that's the case, and we have to follow that very carefully, of course it's not that big a deal, and it's not so dangerous for our states to have more loans than what we, for instance, in Europe have in the Maastricht agreement, 60% loan of GDP. That could increase, and I think this is a good time when you increase your debt, and it's not that dangerous to go over 60%. As you know, Sweden is in a good position. We have only 35%, so we are telling our finance minister and our government to spend as they dare to avoid mass unemployment, and so far this has been very successful. And finally, about the question you raised for all the other participants, I just want to say, as a trade unionist, a worker is a worker is a worker. whatever you call them, platform workers, or if you call them employed, if the service is the same as in Uber, you should treat the individuals as worker. And as we have seen now in the United States, more and more states, including California, are now saying that Uber is an employer of people driving the cars for Uber. And if we do that globally, call a worker and give them the same right, this will be much less fair of people going out into working poor. What is the winning for the world if millions and millions and millions of people are going from permanent employment into be working poor? We saw very clear in Sweden the last years. We have a brilliant development of employment in Sweden. Over 82% of all adults in Sweden has a job. And we saw when increased and we reached full employment, the vulnerable jobs are less. It actually went down in 2 years with over 10%. So if you can keep full employment and low unemployment, I think the fear of people going into working poor condition is much less. So I will regard everybody to think about the worker is a worker is a worker, whatever technique is behind the job they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I really remember your main message to the European authorities: spend, spend, spend. So it's nice to hear that even in Sweden, we don't stick to the unilateral version of a frugal country in the European negotiations that are coming up. It would maybe take us out of the debate. If we go back to the debate, we said previously that there's a form of consensus within all the interventions. There's no big bad wolf, you know, as we don't want to make the platforms the big bad wolf. I give you a quick overview of all the questions that are coming up on my tablet. How do you think we can create jobs with high qualification? This is from Rita. Agathe is asking us, how can we combine the Uberization of societies and ways of work with protection of workers? And Enil is asking us, aren't you afraid of a disengagement of with social fatigue following all these continued disruptions, these disruptions that were so far the driving force of these platforms, but that may show some limits now. Stéphane, CARCILLO, do you want to say something on one of those questions? Or even if there's a general consensus among the interventions, do you want to point out what is wishful thinking or something that is more realistic? Because I heard you all, and I understand that we may want to reinvent a form of social security, a little less ambitious, a little less costly, and within the general frame of employment, what we would call the new employment. There's a lot of leeway to improve the situation of these employed people, because there's a lot of holes in social protection in most countries of the OECD for the full-time employees. So if you have a lot of employees at short-term contract or part-time, the rights are pretty much reduced, and yet they pay very high charges. So we have to reinvent the social protection safety nets so people can have access to training and to insurance, even if we have to imagine some special device like optional systems that they can contribute to if they wish, or if they can afford to, but that we have a gradual approach between zero and a full social protection, so these people can accumulate some rights as they go along in the company and work and accumulate working hours. There's a lot of progress to be made as well on the regulation. We should not think that we can do without these forms of jobs, particularly getting out of the crisis in times of uncertainties, but rather we should regulate them better and through the access to data, which is very important for the independence of the employees and their capacity to get organized. I'm thinking mostly about the employees working on platforms that are considered as companies and that don't have the right to get organized and set like a minimum compensation rate as it would be considered as a fringe on competition law. So if you look at the power of these big platforms and the individual power of a guy who drives a bike or drives a car, there's a gap between that. So they should have the capacity to organize themselves. It's not easy to moderate a debate when the speakers are far away and I just see a little screen, their face on the screen. Who would like to, among you, okay, yeah, Gilles Babinet, do you want to say something about regulation? Because we can imagine that there's a need for more regulation. Is it at the national level, at the European level, at the global level? What is realistic? Yes, it's part of the answer. There really is a globalization of platform workers. And in some areas, we have a physical footprint, for example, the drivers, and in some, you have a delocalization. For example, in all the call centers could be sent to India or to the other end of the world. So there are different cases. What really, to really have a full access to the data, because the regulation will be different from one platform to the other, or one type of platform to the other, there's something that I would like to say in regard of what Stéphane Castillo said, is the notion of optionality of rights. We had some works done to try to understand how it works. You are facing a population that does not wish that their contracts be transformed into fixed term contracts. They want to keep a form of autonomy, and they would like to have the lightness, suppleness towards their employers. And if you propose these optional rights, they will tend to prefer a higher income instead. So I think we are more looking at a safety net of social rights, protection rights, generalized, rather than having them make a choice. That's why I brought up the idea of vocational training, because among the rights that are really important, beyond the access to social security, of course, is the right to training. So you would say that in a certain way, they should be protected despite themselves, because spontaneously they would not tend to ask for protection because it's going to be costly. So if I understand correctly what you said, what we see today is that the platform workers, and it's not the case for all of them, but for a big part of them, they are people who were unemployed, and that's something to be recognized. It's one of the benefits of those platforms, particularly the drivers. We went out and looked at people who were outside of the job market, and we managed to get them back into the job market, so it's a good thing. And these people are young. So when you're young, all the social rights are not necessarily your priority. You think that you're young and you want to enjoy life, and and you want to have more money to enjoy it. An interesting question by Nathan, who just came in. The debate concentrated on the less qualified workers. Could we have your opinion on how we could create employment of high qualification in this system with these new forms of employment? Who would like to answer that question? Raise your hand wherever you are. Gilles Babinet, you just had the floor. Maybe, yeah. Okay, let's go to Australia. I can't hear. No sound. No sound. Is the question how can we create high qualification employment? I think Nathan said on those platforms, so I want to answer the question both ways. Are we talking about the income of the people who make less on those platforms, or the question is how to use these platforms to help creating jobs better qualified? I could imagine that these platforms could be interesting for consultants, qualified consultants, who before were not matched with potential employees. But that may not be the question that Nathan asked. I think in general, these platforms are useful when the workers are quite similar. It's about offering a service that can be recognized, like Uber taxi, for example, and that it will not be the future of the qualified job market, nor a possibility to train better these people for more qualified jobs. I'd like to add something else, which is that we need to have more data on these categories of jobs that are quite atypical. The platforms are different from the one-day temp work, for example, and the reforms on the regulation are different there as well, depending on the category. And to go back to your question of level of qualification, I think some remedies to the problem would vary from one country to the next. So I'm going to quote a text from the OECD, maybe written by Stéphane, saying that the system of unemployment as an incentive for employers to have very short-term contracts. So sometimes the problem can be narrowed down. Yes. Helno, you have the floor. I don't necessarily want to answer that question because I think there's an incompatibility to talk about high qualification and these jobs, because the point of these new jobs is not to reach this level of qualification. As we said before, the point is to have contracts that are as flexible as possible to provide a service and not necessarily to have a relationship employer-employee. But I want to go back to what was said before, because I disagree with what was said on the vision of the young people with their future and how they perceive employment. I think people don't know social rights and the rights that you can acquire later on. The young people don't know it, and it's mostly due to a lack of information, and a lot of data prove it. in the policies on employment, on vocational training, it comes back that we need to improve those information devices, systems on our social rights. So when we have a lack of information on the one hand, an employment rate that is going up, I want to remind you that the access to jobs, and particularly to the first job for young one, is to become autonomous, to start your career. So I don't see how, as a young person, but if I speak, in the name of all, I don't see a young person thinking consciously, oh, I know that I'm going to have a lot of short-term jobs. I'm not thinking long-term. I just want to have the best pay as right now. No, I think a young person also wants to have a security of employment. And those who go from one job to the next because they say, I have the whole life in front of me. No, it was imposed by society to them. And year after year, and it's convenient to companies because they can have a cheaper workforce when people are still young. So I think that when a society is ambitious and has the means to be ambitious with a high GDP, its ambition should be to avoid these types of situations and to protect as quickly as possible its population.
Yes, and indeed, to attain highly qualified jobs, including outside of the platforms, because that is Nathan's question, and that's how he stated the question. How can we create these new jobs, not necessarily within the platforms? You say it's information, training. Are there any other ideas? So let's head for Sweden here with Mr. Thorwaldsson.
Well, I agree 100% what you just said. It's an myth that young people doesn't want to have security. Obviously, especially when you're young, you're more dependent on security than when you're older. When you're making a family and try to buy a home or whatever you want to do when you're young, it's really a necessity to have a loan, to have a secure job. Otherwise, the banks will never give you the possibility to even move from home. So I agree, that's a myth. I think, again, we are debating this in circles. And one of the ideas I heard earlier on was that we need to have less regulation on platform economy and less social cost. About two-thirds of the social cost we have for employment in the OECD countries is to pay for retirement funds. So are you actually meaning that we should have a lot of people don't saving for their retirement just because the company called platform company? Or do you think we should do right from beginning? Treat people as employed, even though the technology behind it is in the platform. That could not be the difference of employment. That must be also only a question for employers trying to avoid cost for workers. And actually, according to OECD, last 20 years, we created a lot of new high-skilled jobs and a lot of new low-skilled jobs. The problem is the jobs in the middle that have disappeared. So it must be much better to try to reskill people to have higher-end jobs and to create better conditions for people with less skills and to have permanent employment also for platform workers.
Thank you. Stéphane Cassiu would like to speak. Just to react to this question of training and information, it's very important. I gave an example with young people coming out of university can try and get off the ground. And today, new forms of employment, new statuses such as the French auto-entrepreneur, where people are independent, they work for themselves, they're self-employed. It's very easy to work with this type of system, and it helps these young people to get off the ground. They can create a company, etc. The problem is they need support. They also need training, because when you are self-employed, you do need to have a minimum amount of knowledge in terms of management, and also to develop and move on to the next step, meaning to be able be in a position to recruit somebody. They also need support for that. And training exists for this. And for the time being, in most countries, these young people, or not so young people who are self-employed, don't benefit from this training. And they don't have a lot of information either on their rights. So information and training should be implemented so that these jobs are springboards rather than jobs in which you just kind of get by without building any skills. So we all want to agree with this, of course. But then we need to, face up to the reality of companies. So I can't ask the question to a representative of a platform, but I can ask somebody from the corporate world. Mr. GUIONY, what do you think about that? Does this information, this training be funded by these platforms or by companies generally speaking? Could it not be mutualized? I think that's a very good point that is being raised here. I'm not going to agree with the point of view of platform because LVMH is rather different due to the profitability question. But it's not just a question of profitability. We must bear in mind that most of these platforms don't earn any money. It doesn't mean that they're vulnerable, but it means that they've signed contracts, even though they have easy access to capital. They also have certain constraints. But from the point of view of the platform, which I'm trying to illustrate here, although it's not my point of view, it's clear that for platforms, and in particular for the question of flexibility of supply, it is essential to integrate in a monolithical manner using the laws in play. It's impossible to integrate people as employees. It's not at all aligned with their business model. So regarding these imbalances that have been mentioned so many times during the discussions, the only response that we can bring is a rather monolithic response, which is that service providers should be treated as employees. I don't think that that works. And that's why I talked about the question of profitability. Every time that a platform develops in a country, they lose money. So they won't go to a country if they think that by going into that country, they won't find the right conditions for their long-term development. And we will lose jobs. So I don't agree with this blackmailing for employment, which might seem rather genetic to these platforms. But if we can, if we bring solutions which are against their genetic competition, it won't work. So then there are questions of trade unions, training. There are a lot of important things that I mentioned, and there's the question of economic dependency and a form of mutual insurance. All of that can work. But I wanted to say so that monolithical response, when we say they should be treated just like employees, I don't think it will work because it won't allow the platforms to manage the flexibility of their work and their supply, which is essential for their survival. So all of the improvements that you suggested with regard to the legal framework, economic dependency, the mutual insurance fund funded by the platforms, what do you think the right level is? Is it at each state that we should progress on these questions, or at the European level or the global level? How do we move from this nice program to the actual implementation? I think that the real answer is not at the level of the state, it's at the level of the competition. If, in order to be competitive, the platforms must offer mutual insurance system, a system of economic dependency, and be attractive, attract the service providers. If they can't attract the service providers, they won't work. So if in order to attract them, they need to implement the different tools that have been mentioned, not only by myself, but by others. Gilles in particular mentioned a certain number of tools. They will do it. If we impose this upon them at the state level, it won't work, because certain states will do it, others won't, and therefore the platforms will play on the different situations in different states in order to go for the best solution for them. So regarding competition, should we allow monopolies to develop at the national level, at the international level, which will be in a position to dictate their laws? So in the ideal world that you're describing, so a first company should begin to do it. They have a good reputation, they attract talents, and therefore the second platform will imitate them. That's what you believe in. Do you think, the other speakers, do you think that that can work? Gilles Babinet? The experience we have, because we've been debating for many years with these platforms, and I participated in these discussions myself. I think that what Jean-Jacques GUIONY just said, the markets are not rational with rational agents at that level, but experience shows that they fight hard against the fact of paying social charges. I'm not even talking about the actual qualification of the job. But if you like, I think that we need regulation for a certain number of things. Access to data, they won't give you data due to competition. We need to oblige them to give us access to data. A minimum amount of social rights. At what level? State, continent, world? You talked about New York, for example. Well, the ideal situation would be that it be global, but we know that would be very naive. That will never happen. Therefore, we can come down to the European level, except that, of course, you have Karlstein-type dynamics, a qualification of the labor market, which have been very largely described in France. But at the level of the state, I don't generally defend the state's logic here, but you have the possibility of targeting local characteristics. The French labor market is very different from the labor market in Luxembourg. And even, so you have very big differences. France has a preference. I'm sorry, this is very provocative to say this, but France has a preference for unemployment. It's not necessarily negative to say this, but we've chosen a high level of social protection. And it means that to a certain extent, access to employment is even more difficult. Therefore, platforms really have a role to play. I was very impressed when I saw, before we entered a certain level of regulation, the Guillaume law, which was tragical for the platforms, we turned towards people who were in peri-urban areas who didn't have work, and it was wonderful. And then we broke those dynamics by obliging people to take silly written exams so that you could drive a Uber taxi, for example. But we can very well say that in France, the structural unemployment is very high, around 5 or 6%. And so we can reach out to people who are stuck in a rut, who can't get onto the first step of the ladder of employment, with the idea that it is a transitory phase. So I'd like to come back to the point I said earlier. If you have information, and this was quite rightly said by Jean-Jacques, if people are informed as to their rights to training, for example, something for me, I have house cleaner who I pay with a special system, and I tell her that she does have right to training, but she didn't know that. So in that case, you can really create a tremendous springboard. And I think that we shouldn't be focusing on the idea of requalification. We need to see the potential of this springboard. If I were the regulator, the legislator, I would work practically exclusively into creating these, turning these platforms into springboards. Jennifer. Yes, I would like to ask the French speakers if you know what the average duration of employment is for Uber or any other platform, because in the United States, for example, the average... Sorry, just to clarify the question, what do you mean by employment? Because they're not employees. Are you talking about Uber employees, service providers you're talking about then? Yes, in the sense, I'm talking about people driving cars at Uber. And how long do they do this for? And so the duration generally is 3 months. Nobody considers this as being a first step on the ladder of a career. However, it's quite obvious that in France, contrary to long-term contracts, a lot of people like Uber conditions. However, long-term contracts, nobody would have preferred a short-term contract, of course. And these short-term contracts, of different short-term contracts that can last for years and years, not the same one, of course, but they're renewed, or other people have the short-term contracts. So some solutions would be, it would be solutions for people on short-term contracts or independent workers, and not for the platforms themselves. Because if you spend 3 months with Uber, you're not really thinking about your retirement pension. The social benefits associated to the job are not a key question for these people. So the question is what's happening outside of the platforms and what opportunities are there for people outside of the platforms. But above all, outside of these short-term contracts and the situations of dependency. So we have just 1 minute left to conclude. So unfortunately, I cannot pass the floor to everybody. In just a few seconds, does anybody wish to add a piece of information that is very important to them? If not, if this is not the case, I will draw a very brief conclusion, because I've been asked to really stick to the time here, and we have to hand back the listening space. So I have the impression that this intervention was very technically difficult, but it allowed everybody, I believe, to present their point of view. These were very complimentary and very enriching, and you played the game very well. So I would like to say thank you to everybody. I would like to wish you a very good day and see you soon.